welcome to Friends Residency app, the ultimate platform for residents preparing for their MD/MS university exams. I'm Dr. Riya Mitra, your faculty for Physiology, and today we'll be discussing the topic of fast and slow electrical responses in cardiac muscle. Now let us see that if in exam you come across these questions, how will you deal with them? The electrical responses in cardiac muscles are classified as fast response and as slow response depending on the type of the cardiac tissue and the specific ionic mechanisms involved. These responses are vital for the synchronization of electrical activity and contraction in the heart. Now, the fast responses, they occur in atrial and ventricular myocytes and Purkinje fibers, which are specialized for rapid conduction, while the slow response, it occurs in sinoatrial node and atrioventricular node, that is the SA node and the AV node, which the cells are specialized for automaticity and slower conduction. So coming to fast response, if we have to draw a graph for fast response, it will look like this. Right? So if we have to mark them, this is 0, this is, this is 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4. Phase 1, 2, 3, 4 and phase 0. Now we start the curve for the fast response from phase 4. That is the resting membrane potential. The resting membrane potential for cardiac muscle is in the range of -85 to +90 millivolt. Now, due to high permeability to potassium ions, the potassium via the inward rectifier channels, they are effluxed, because of which repolarization is achieved and the resting membrane potential is achieved. The sodium and calcium channels are closed. So in phase 4, there is activation of inward rectifier potassium channels and there is closure of sodium and calcium channels. Now coming to phase 0. Here is the phase 0. Phase 0 is the phase of rapid depolarization, as you can see by the rapid upstroke of the curve, right? This phase 0 is the phase of rapid depolarization. It is triggered by opening of fast voltage gated sodium channels. Opening of fast voltage gated sodium channels. The rapid influx of sodium causes the membrane potential to rise sharply to +30 millivolt. This phase is fast because of high density and rapid kinetics of sodium channels. Next, we move on to phase 1. Phase 1 is known as early repolarization. There is transient outward potassium current. There is transient outward potassium current which briefly lowers the membrane potential, and this creates the characteristic notch on the action potential. This point here, as you can see, is the notch. This notch here is created by the outward or transient outward potassium current. Next, we see the phase 2. Phase 2 is a plateau phase. Right? This here is a plateau phase. Phase 2 is the plateau phase and is the balance between inward calcium current and outward potassium current. It is the balance between inward calcium current and outward potassium current. The inward calcium current is through L-type calcium channels and the outward potassium current is through delayed rectifier potassium channels. Now, what was the channel which was responsible for the fourth phase or the resting, or for bringing the membrane potential to the resting membrane potential? It was the inward rectifier channel. right? It was the inward rectifier potassium channel, and in case of the plateau phase, the channel that is responsible is the delayed rectifier potassium channel. Now, sustained depolarization is essential for excitation, contraction, coupling. Now, coming to phase 3, or which is the final repolarization, the calcium channels close and outward potassium currents dominate. In phase 3, as you can see here, the calcium channels which were opened during the plateau phase have now closed and the outward potassium current dominates, which restores the membrane potential to the resting membrane potential. That was the fourth phase. So this was the fast response, right? Whenever in exam you have a question on fast response, you will first mention that in what type of tissues it is seen. You will draw the curve for the fast response. Then you will describe the various phases of fast response, starting with the fourth phase, that is the resting membrane potential. Then the zero phase, that is the rapid depolarization. Phase 1, that is the early repolarization. Phase 2, that is the plateau phase, and finally the third phase, that is the final repolarization. Now coming to slow response curve or the slow response, we have to draw a curve for a slow response. Let us see. It will look like this, right? Now, if here also we have to mark the various phases. Let us see where they will be. This phase here will be the phase 0, this one phase 4, and this will be phase 3, that is the repolarization phase. Now the slow responses, as I've said before, is seen in sinoatrial node and atrioventricular node, where the cells are specialized for automaticity and slower conduction. Now phases of the slow response are phase 4, that is the pacemaker potential or the pre-potential. In phase 4, there is gradual depolarization. There is gradual depolarization. The funny currents, because of T-type calcium channels or the transient type calcium channels and the reduced potassium efflux. The funny currents are slow inward calcium currents which are activated by hyperpolarization. The T-type calcium channels contribute to further depolarization, and then there is reduced potassium efflux, all of which culminate to bring about the pacemaker potential or the pre-potential, that is in the phase 0. Now this pacemaker potential or pre-potential phase determines the intrinsic heart rate. Moving on to phase 0. Phase 0 is the phase of depolarization. This here is the phase of depolarization. This is brought about by L-type calcium channels. They open, causing a slow influx of calcium. When L-type calcium channels open, they bring about a slow influx of calcium. There is no involvement of sodium channels due to their inactivation at the less negative resting membrane potential of the nodal cells or the SA nodal or the AV nodal cells. The slower upstroke compared to the fast response tissues. As you can see, the upstroke here is slower compared to the upstroke of the fast response tissue, which was quite faster. Moving to phase 3. Phase 3 is the phase of repolarization. Here the L-type calcium channels close. Potassium efflux through delayed rectifier potassium channel restores the membrane potential. Absence of phase 1 and phase 2. There is absence of phase 1 and phase 2 in the slow response curve. The slow response lacks distinct early repolarization and plateau phases seen in the fast response. Now, let us see some of the key differences between fast and slow responses. Now coming to the fast response here, slow response. First, let us see based on the location. Fast response is seen in the atria, ventricles and the Purkinje fibers, while the slow response is seen in SA node and AV node. The resting membrane potential for fast response, or in case of ventricles, is between -85 to -90 millivolt, while in case of the slow response fibers, it is approximately -60 millivolt. Next, upstroke ion in case of fast response is sodium, which is the fast sodium channels, and in case of slow response it is calcium. As you would have appreciated that in the slow response there is no contribution of sodium in the upstroke, right? So the calcium brings about the slow response via the L-type calcium channels. Now the conduction velocity is rapid in case of fast response and is slow in case of slow response. Now phases. Coming to the phases, all 5 phases are present, that is phase 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4, while in case of the slow response, there are only 3 phases, 0, 1 and 3. There is absence of phase 1 and phase 2. Next, there is threshold potential difference. In fast response, it is approximately -70 millivolt, while in case of slow response, it is -40 millivolt. Now coming to the physiological and clinical significance. Now whenever you answer a question on fast response and slow response, it's always good to end your question with its physiological and clinical significance. Now coming to fast response, there is rapid conduction that ensures synchronized contraction of the atria and ventricles, and abnormalities can lead to arrhythmias like re-entrant tachycardia. Now, the significance of slow response is that the automaticity of SA node sets the heart rate. As we have seen, the pre-potential or the pacemaker potential is necessary for the determination of heart rate. The AV node, the AV node delay allows for ventricular filling before contraction, and the impairments, example in ischemia or fibrosis, can cause heart blocks or altered pacemaker activity. This should be all for the fast response and slow response. Thank you so much for learning physiology with me today. For more updated contents and high-age topics, please follow and download the Friends Residency app. You'll get the link in the description. Please share it with more of your other resident friends and like the video. Share the video, subscribe the video and like the video. Thank you.